What's up, everybody? We are here with the Deeper Podcast. We are back.
We're
Survived
back.
the snow.
Survived the snow. Snowed last week. We got the podcast in, though.
Yeah,
a
we
couple
did.
of pros.
We did.
We didn't shut down the world for 25 days like the rest of the Southeast Texas.
That was pretty crazy,
I'm
though.
assuming there's still some people who aren't in school, because, it's only 60 degrees. Until it gets 70, it might not be safe to get out.
It was pretty crazy.
It was crazy. I was just laughing at all the schools, man, different things. Like even here in Buna, and I don't know, maybe it's some of y'all watching that were like, I can't believe we're going back Thursday. I saw one little spot on our road that had like a wet spot, and what are we going to do? The bus is going to slide off the road and kill 75 kids. It's like, really? Maybe they're just you're fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the way our house is, there's like a half of our yard is just shade and never gets sun.
Yeah.
Dude, we had snow till, we had a lot of snow.
Was there still a little bit yesterday?
Saturday morning.
Yeah.
It finally all left, but it was crazy.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
If the sun doesn't hit it, it'll hang around.
It was pretty wild,
and especially if it's a bunch of it together, so people who made snowmen and stuff. I saw lots of pictures the weekend. They were like, "It's still here," and I'm like, "Yeah." If we've in the past. In fact, we had a big ball of it. Like Margie tried to do like a snowman base, and it rolled off into the ditch, and she just couldn't get it back out because it was too heavy, and it stayed there for several days.
That's awesome.
So yeah, snowman. It's pretty exciting.
It was fun.
Snow, man, not snowman.
So yesterday we had a good baptisms. We had 4 baptisms. Pretty
Speaking
awesome.
of snow, it was pretty cold in there.
It was pretty cold, dude. I was very surprised.
I don't understand.
What
our
happened?
heater. I know our heater works. We just probably need to turn it on earlier.
I guess so. Yeah, and it wasn't super cold outside.
No, well, I mean the water temperature probably that's part of the difference is when it starts from a lower place than it normally does. But anyways,
it was still chilly.
New life.
Yeah.
They need to celebrate.
It was pretty awesome though.
Yeah.
Started off at 4, and then talked about keeping the main thing.
That's right.
Which was pretty good.
Yeah. So
pretty excited.
The plain things are the main things. So keep the main things the plain things. Yeah. So
the question I wrote down when you started was, which is a funny question, which I think we should think about a lot, because you kind of broke down the cultural viewpoint of this. I say cultural, it's actually really mainly our church's now view of who Christ is was Jesus nice or was he actually loving? And what the difference, that was the question I kind of got from that. Like what, you kind of talked about the difference between this idea we have of Jesus, or this idea that the church has kind of pushed forth, this idea of, you kind of started off saying, we think of this nice Jesus who is all like rainbows and everything like that, and then, but that's not really the Jesus we really see, because he's actually showing us what true love looks like. Yeah.
So let me explain, in case context for listeners, how we get to that point. Because the text yesterday in 1 Timothy, Paul said to this young pastor who is at a church where there are people from all different kinds of backgrounds, different faiths, no faiths, and all have come together literally out of witchcraft and pagan backgrounds, Jewish religious backgrounds, or no religious backgrounds, and now they're mishmashed into this growing church. And teachers were kind of just getting out there, talking about some weird stuff that was beyond what they needed to think about and swerving away from the truth. And Paul said to young Timothy, correct those false teachers. And really, by false teachers, he said correct false teaching. So he didn't even really call them false teachers, and I kind of used that emphasis on that last syllable on purpose, because the Bible actually will say root out, expose, get rid of false teachers. He doesn't say that to Timothy in 1 Timothy. Instead, he says remain there and instruct certain people not to teach false doctrine. So the first point of our message yesterday was correct false doctrine.
Correct them.
And where we got to your question is the sad reality of our world today is any attempt at correcting people is assumed not nice or not loving or not kind. And it breaks that 11th commandment that I've joked about, thou shalt be nice. And as soon as you try to correct anybody else, what people immediately assume is that you are prideful or arrogant. Like, who are you? That's the first question people ask. Who are you to correct me about anything? And then the second thing that I said that people end up getting to that is difficult for all of us is they will even suggest it is unloving to talk to people that way and correct them. But the Bible is going to consistently call us to lovingly correct people. So the world may say it's not nice to point out a flaw in somebody, but if I love you, I ought to be able to do that. So I think about like a few weeks ago before church started. I don't know if Roland and Penny listen to this anymore. So if they do, he's getting a shout out. If not, he won't even know about this. But it's like a month and a half ago on a Sunday morning, I'm in Roland's classroom before they use the multipurpose room for their Bible class. So I'm in the multipurpose room with Roland. We're just talked about things for a few minutes. And then I said, all right, I better go and get some things going. He said, hey, before you run into anybody else, you may want to get a Kleenex and kind of, he didn't say any jokes about, there's a bat out of the cave or anything like that, but basically said, you got a little something there you may want to take care of. Some people would say, well, that was kind of rude of him.
Yeah.
But you know what I think? I think that's pretty dang loving, right?
Yeah.
To stop me from the rest of my morning greeting people, guests who are at our church for the first time with like a booger hanging out of my nose, right? Like, thank you, Brother Roland, right? That was a loving thing to do, to gently correct me and help me. So the problem is, biblically speaking, most of the time when we seek to correct somebody, the response is not, wow, that was helpful. It's almost always, and I use that phrase, I've been doing ministry since I was 16 years old in some capacity or another. I was the music minister at my home church as a junior in high school. So for over 2 decades, I have been in ministry, and what I would tell you is that I don't even know, it will not surpass one hand attempts at gentle correction that worked out well. Because nobody likes to be corrected.
Yeah.
Same thing with even in my capacity now as your boss and leader and shepherd, there are times where I have to say, hey guys, we really need to, and honestly, we love each other enough that we get through it, but you never like it. Yeah. You're never like, wow, man, that correction just edifies my soul. Thank you, Rusty, for, doing that. No, our immediate response tends to go back to Jesus, and we're like, easy for you to get the speck in my eye, log boy, when you've got this whole, that's our immediate response, isn't it? Where Jesus, the point of that in the Sermon on the Mount, which we talked about, I guess last summer when we walked through that passage, the point is not that we should never correct one another. Jesus says, get the log out of your own eye, then you can help get the speck out of your brother's eye. So as we're walking with Jesus, we ought to correct each other. But this is not just talking about personal interaction. This is talking about when the church itself, when teaching, when beliefs are getting off kilter, when we are being swayed away by what he called in this text, fruitless discussion. So the early church here in Ephesus, we don't know exactly what they were dealing with. I lean towards this being some sort of Jewish religious legalism based on the genealogies factor.
Which is interesting because I was taught it was Gnosticism.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it doesn't really matter ultimately. But and even Gnosticism is such a, if this is kind of Bible scholar talk, narcissism is kind of like a junk drawer word.
Yeah, it's it's
like
broad.
Gnostic just means, like agnostic means you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? So Gnostic just means knowledge and what you need to do to attain knowledge. So Gnosticism took so many different forms. I feel like it's just like an easy to be like, yeah, man, there was like some Gnosticism that crept up.
That is true. It is kind of like, a throwaway word. Yeah.
All of us have some Gnostic kind of beliefs.
I guess so.
Anyways, but that's another discussion for another time. But regardless of what it was, there's this false teaching that had crept in that revolved around genealogies and their pursuit of knowledge, whether that be through Jewish methods or some other worldly secular methods. But all that to say, Paul says it's wasting your time.
Yep.
It's fruitless. It has no benefit for you or anybody else. So sometimes the false teaching is not necessarily just dangerous.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of times it is. But sometimes it's just pointless and you're wasting your time.
Yep. Do you think they I think you mentioned this yesterday. Before we, because I also want to, I then want to talk about what's the correct way. Like, what is the way that Paul shows us is the correct way to he doesn't correct them in the way that we would correct them, right? And you talked about that yesterday. He corrects them in a very different way, and he does it all throughout his letters. But before that, do you think they were spreading this false teaching to try to divide the church, or do you think they were just adding things to their knowledge of who God was? What do you think about, which one do you think? Like, do you think they were wolves in sheep's clothing, or do you think they just had a wrong idea of certain things?
Yeah, Paul doesn't seem to think that they were wolves. That's why I wanted to ask. Paul seems to indicate that these were teachers who just had a desire to do well. In fact, and that's why I think the gentle gospel correction comes in, because he says in verse 7, they want to be teachers of the law. But then he says, basically, they're ignorant, though. Yeah. They don't understand the law and what they're trying to say. And that's why he encourages Timothy to correct them, to lead them in the right way, in essence, to teach them to teach. Yeah. And I see this with teachers a lot, young teachers and young preachers. And this is why I kind of used the introduction that I did yesterday, which I know I could see people feeling attacked all around the room, and I was like, I wasn't trying to do that. And in the moment, I was like, it's too late now. I'm already doing it. So I just kept going. But because every one of those types of preachers that I talked about, there are different people in our congregation who are like, that's my guy. Mm-hmm. That's my guy. That's my guy. And, some of them were like, oh, I could just almost see their faces. And I was like, and sometimes it doesn't help to caveat a sermon to death, though. But what we've done for us is we hear preachers and we hear other preachers and we hear people talk about the preachers they like. So we immediately aspire to be like them. So we end up trying to sound like, little versions of whether it be John MacArthur, David Jeremiah. On the other end of the spectrum, you got some people like Andy Stanley or Stephen Furtick. And again, none of these are names that I would necessarily recommend all the way, or, actually some of them I would more than others. I would maybe even, I don't mind, this is the Deeper Podcast, to tell you to maybe avoid some Andy and Stephen. But we probably have people in our church who love them and listen to them regularly, just knowing that in the evangelical world today. So you've got all these teachers across the spectrum doing different things, and we see that, we hear that, we see the ones that are gaining popularity, we see the ones that people really like. And listen, any teacher wants people to enjoy their teaching. So we end up, trying to find things that are special about our teaching. And this is what happens. So we end up mimicking some of these other people, or we try to develop our own thing that's unique and special about us. One thing I do when I teach is like I want to kind of carve a niche and like have something that's distinctly rusty in my preaching and teaching that people will like and enjoy. And the danger of that is at some point, we emphasize communication and emphasize uniqueness and want to really bring something fresh and new to the table, and we leave behind the main thing, the truth about the Word of God. And that's really what I was trying to, I think Paul was trying to warn Timothy and tell him to warn others about, is, man, don't get lost in all this novelty and this unique stuff and trying to, find all these cool things. And I think this happens in a variety of ways. In a church like ours, we have so many people who are believers who have been believers for a long time, right? Like they've known Jesus, been walking with him for a long time. So in their pursuit of just more and more knowledge, they end up getting deeper and deeper into random wormholes from time to time, where I've seen it maybe in some people who are obsessed with the end times. Yeah. Okay. Yep. And a gentle correction sometimes is, is it okay to study the end times and have different theories? Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, the Bible, I think, would encourage that. But if you are obsessed with the end times and that's all you're doing is looking at the newspaper and trying to determine the date Jesus is going to come back, I would want to gently correct you. And even there are ministries that are built on that. There are podcasts that every single week they're talking about the current events and how certainly that means Jesus coming back tomorrow. So thank you for listening to this podcast that we've been doing for 35 years, talking about Jesus coming back next week because of this news story. And it's like, at some point, it's like, come back to the gospel.
Yep.
And that's just one example. I think there are other ways people can get drawn off into mysticism, I think is another one, experiential vibes, and we kind of get lost in this world and we get away from the gospel. So I'm not saying that you should never talk about any of these things, but what I am saying is that if we're not careful, you can build a ministry on something other than the Word of God. And what you will end up doing is leading people away from the truth. And that's what Paul, I think, is trying to call them back to.
Yeah, so you finished the message yesterday with the aim of teaching. And that's kind of what you're talking about. Paul kind of shows us what the aim of teaching should be. And it really is simply, he keeps the main thing the main thing. It's very, I learned this in school, and you reiterated it yesterday, how Paul, if anybody could do it, like if anybody could be the guy to break down each of these false teachers' doctrine, he would be the guy to do it. He is the intelligent one. He is the scholar. He is the one that could break down these views, these theological ideas, break them down, and then show you the truth of them. But instead, he gently corrects them and just simply shows them the gospel.
Yeah.
Shows them the message of Christ.
Yeah, and I think that's something worth pointing out. There are times where Paul, and Jesus would as well, but Paul in his letters will specifically identify false teachers. So we'll talk about this gentle correcting, and then in 2 weeks, he's going to be like, some people have made a shipwreck of their faith. Yeah, Hymenaeus and Alexander. And he's like naming names, dropping like, these guys, they've really made So there are times and places where we do need to identify and call things out by name. So there are going to be seasons where I have to do that as a pastor, where we are called to do that for the good of the flock that we shepherd. But by and large, what we see Paul do, rather than saying, hey, let me unpack the dangers of the Judaizers, these Jewish religious legalists, or the Gnostics, or whoever, or whatever these false teachers are trying to put together. Instead, what he does is just reminds them of the truth of the gospel. And the heart behind that is that when you see the gospel for what it is, everything else will pale in comparison when you see the real thing. So, the classic illustration you hear people use is that counterfeit people, when they're training people to see counterfeit money, they don't spend all of their time looking at fakes. Instead, they spend most of their time studying the real thing. Yeah. And when they know the real thing inside and out, as soon as they see something that's false, they identify it because they know the real thing and have experienced so much. So that's what we're called to do, is show people the gospel and preach the gospel in such a way that anything that's not the gospel, people would say, wait a second, this is counterfeit. This isn't real. So that's really the goal, and that's the aim of our teaching, is to keep the main thing the plain thing, and the plain thing the main thing, so that people know we're swerving from the truth. Yep. We're getting lost in fruitless and vain discussions that aren't benefiting anybody. And at best, they're just worthless, but at their worst, they actually can be damaging and distracting to the body of Christ.
They can be, man. Yeah. No, I'm thankful we're walking through this. I think it's a good time. We got a crazy world with a lot of opinions. Yeah. We got a lot of church opinions as well. And I think this is a great book and a great letter to walk through with our church family. So I'm excited for it. I think it's been good so far.
Yeah, we got a lot of things to go through. It's going to be interesting to see where the Lord takes us in the next few months. I'm excited to do it.
Yep. Well, I think that's anything else you want to add to it?
Yeah, I would just love to say we'd love to have you at church.
Yep.
We have space for you.
We do.
Got to use our new parking lot yesterday.
I was about to ask. That's the first time?
There were about 32 cars on it, and they said there were room for a bunch more. So that was encouraging.
Awesome.
We kind of, we've known it looks big, but we haven't known exactly how many spots we're going to get out of it. But honestly, I'd already said 30 to 40 would be enough and would be nice and would be a help. But it looks like we may be more in that 40 to 50 range by the time the smoke clears.
Yeah, we got room for you. Yeah, so come join us.
So, it was a good day and excited for what the Lord's doing. Man, if you listen to the podcast, let me just remind you of the few announcements we got that we're excited about. Purpose Ministry Talent Show is coming up here in a few weeks. I believe the date for that is February the 22nd. There's an art show at 4:30 and followed by the talent show at 6. We want you to come hang out. That's going to be a lot of fun. But a couple things I really wanted to share is not this Saturday, but next Saturday, February the 8th, we have a men's breakfast. That's just going to be a time where our men get together, eat some breakfast, fellowship with one another. So February the 8th at 8 o'clock, that's going to be really special. We want people to come hang out for that. That's going to be a lot of fun. Yep. And then on February the 16th, we're going to have a chili cook-off for everybody in the church that afternoon. So make some chili, come eat some chili. You will have a vote. Your vote will count We're going to let everybody vote, and we'll
Caleb
name
and I are going to
the
win
best. I doubt it, but
Caleb
y'all can
and
try.
I are winning this year.
So we're gonna have a good time. That'll be fun. Just a time to hang out with our church family. So, yeah. So I'm sure I'm missing some things, but those are some of the things we're real excited about. Want you to kind of put on your calendar and be ready to do. So, come hang out with us, fellowship with us, and then when we have opportunity, come gather around the Word with us.
Sounds good, man. Yeah, Lord's doing some awesome things. So we want you to be a part of it. But we will see you guys next week. Peace.